I remember the morning like it was a punch to the chest, the kind that leaves your lungs tight and your heart racing in disbelief. I had driven down the familiar dirt path to my family's land, the place my grandparents had worked, dreamed over, and loved for generations, expecting the usual quiet of birds in the trees and sunlight spilling across the hills. But instead I was greeted by the roar of machines and the smell of fresh asphalt, the sight of 35 houses rising from the earth where wildflowers and old oak trees had once stood. My stomach dropped as I parked and walked closer, each step heavier than the last, seeing foundation poured where my grandfather had taught me to fish in a small creek, seeing concrete walls replacing the hollow where we used to gather for summer picnics, and realizing that everything I thought was mine, everything I had cherished since I was a child, was being swallowed by something I could barely even comprehend. I tried to calm myself as I saw the workers moving with the precision of an army, bulldozers shifting earth without hesitation, trucks lined up like an endless stream, and a perfectly painted sign at the edge of the property announcing the new development, bold letters stating that it was approved by the HOA, their logo glaring like a warning. I felt anger mixed with disbelief, knowing I had never signed any documents, never given permission, never agreed to a single plan. Yet here they were, turning my sanctuary into someone else's project without a thought for my history, my memories, or the life that had been nurtured on this land for decades. I ran my hands over the bark of an old oak tree, one that had stood longer than most of the houses around here, feeling its rough texture and the weight of generations, and I realized that no legal notice, no sign, and no HOA letter could erase the years of family love embedded in this soil. But still, I couldn't deny the knot of fear twisting in my chest because I knew battles with these people were never simple, and the law seemed to bend to those with money and influence, not to someone trying to protect a legacy. I remembered my grandmother's voice, calm but firm, telling me stories of when she had fought for every inch of this land, teaching me that land was not just property. It was identity, it was history, it was blood and sweat carried through generations, and now I was standing in the middle of that inheritance being transformed into rows of identical homes with neat lawns and streets that cut across my memories like knives. I called the HOA office immediately, demanding answers, and the voice on the other end was smooth, polite, almost rehearsed, telling me that everything was legal and that the construction was within our rights. And I remember feeling my chest tighten as if the air itself had turned to lead because those words made no sense. They ignored decades of family presence, the roots that were deeper than any contract, the countless times my grandparents had walked these hills and dreamed for the future. I drove around the perimeter, seeing neighbors arriving in shiny cars, small children running where my old dog used to roam, and each laugh, each step, each sign of life that didn't belong to me, felt like a cut that wouldn't heal, making me question how quickly the world could erase the things that meant the most, how easily power and bureaucracy could crush personal history. That night I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and imagining the machines tearing through every tree, the land losing its voice under concrete and asphalt, thinking about ways to fight, about letters, calls, even legal action, but knowing deep down that the system I was up against was cold and practiced, a well-oiled machine that had no empathy for sentiment or legacy. I walked the edges of the property at dawn, the mist rising from the creek and the air thick with anticipation, and I realized that there was something still mine, a piece of the past that had been overlooked, a dam my grandfather had built, and forgotten by everyone else, a silent reservoir holding both water and memory, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, because maybe, just maybe, I still had a way to make the land speak, to remind the world that some things could not be taken without consequence, that family history was not negotiable, that the heart of this land was mine to protect, and that if they didn't respect it, nature itself might have to intervene in ways they could never anticipate. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the trees, and I stood at the edge of the forgotten dam, feeling the cool water beneath my fingertips, and in that quiet moment, I swore to myself that I would not let this go, that I would find a way to honor the land, to honor my grandparents, and to confront the HOA and the new homes with a reminder that no amount of construction, no matter how polished, could erase the legacy rooted in every hill, every tree, every stone of this place that had been mine long before they ever arrived. I didn't yet know how I would act, but the determination settled in me like steel, and as the wind whispered across the creek and through the old oaks, I knew the land was listening, and it would not forget what had been taken, and I would make sure that whatever came next would leave no question about whose heart beat strongest on this land. I spent the next few days trying everything I could think of, pacing the edges of my property, calling lawyers, sending emails, attending HOA meetings that felt more like performances than discussions, each one leaving me more frustrated, more aware of how powerless I seemed against the machinery of their organization. And yet my anger grew alongside a stubborn determination, because this was not just about property lines or zoning codes. It was about my family, my history, and the memories embedded in every inch of that land. And every time I saw another wall rise, another driveway paved, I felt a pang of loss as sharp as a knife, a reminder that the past could be buried under neat rows of new homes if no one stood up for it. At the HOA meetings, the board members smiled politely, nodded, and repeated the same rehearsed lines about permits and compliance, as if their words could erase the fact that they had steamrolled generations of family legacy. And I realized quickly that reasoning with them was like trying to argue with a storm, their bureaucracy impenetrable, their calm masks hiding the fact that money and influence always had the final word. Neighbors began moving in, waving cheerfully as though they had no idea the ground beneath their feet had been a home to someone else for decades, their laughter ringing across the hills while I sat on my porch, gripping a coffee mug until the ceramic ached in my hands, wondering how anyone could live so happily without knowing the story of what had been taken, how they could stroll across the old creek beds and imagine it was theirs to claim, while I felt the land itself weep with every tread, as if it remembered what had been lost and was silently calling for justice. At night I would wander under the stars, the air cool and the silence broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl, imagining the dam that had been forgotten, a quiet sentinel of water and memory, and thinking of the possibilities it represented, the power it held to remind people that land was more than a commodity. It was living history, and the idea of using it as a voice began to take shape, tentative at first, but growing bolder with each passing day, until the thought of standing by the water, controlling the flow, feeling the force of nature itself moving across what had been taken from me, became an almost irresistible plan that promised both validation and satisfaction without harm, a way to act decisively in a situation where the law and the HOA had left me powerless. I began walking the perimeter constantly, noticing every detail I had once ignored, the slope of the land, the old stone channels my grandfather had built to manage, water, the pressure points in the dam, the small creek that ran unseen behind rows of newly planted shrubs, and the more I observed, the more I realized how little they understood about the land they had claimed, how blind they were to the memory and history woven into it, and that ignorance became my ally, a secret the land whispered to me, telling me that the right action could have an impact far beyond words or paperwork, that nature itself could speak where bureaucracy failed. The more I watched the construction, the more I noticed little mistakes, the way machines had compacted soil over delicate channels, the way drains had been poorly placed, the way the land resisted them quietly, each oversight becoming a thread I could follow, a plan I could form, and I felt a rush of anticipation mixed with caution because I knew one wrong move could backfire, but one careful act could shift the balance in a way that no legal letter ever could, a reminder that respect for the land was not optional, and that sometimes power came from understanding forces that could not be ignored. My nights were restless, filled with calculations and strategies, imagining the flow of water across the new streets, imagining the slow, deliberate return of balance without causing harm, without crossing into true destruction, just enough to make the message clear that this land belonged to someone who knew it intimately, and that those who ignored that truth would be reminded in the most undeniable way. Tension grew not only in the land but in me, twisting my emotions between anger, fear, determination, and a strange exhilaration, because for the first time in weeks I felt some control, some tangible way to act against the injustice, and I found myself drawn to the dam more and more, running my fingers along the mossy stone walls, listening to the water trickle, visualizing it growing stronger, unstoppable yet precise, a reflection of the resolve I was building inside myself. I started taking notes, sketching maps, calculating volumes, measuring slopes, studying every inch of the property as though the land itself was giving me a secret language to decipher, a way to reclaim a voice in the face of an indifferent system, and each discovery made me more confident that what I was planning could be done, that the message could be delivered without hurting a soul, just asserting presence, history, and respect in a way the HOA and the new neighbors could not ignore. Every encounter with the board or their representatives increased the tension, the polite smiles and carefully chosen words only fueling the fire inside me. A fire that was not about revenge in its rawest form but about asserting dignity, about making sure the land and the past were recognized, about showing that even against power and bureaucracy, a single person who understood the essence of a place could make a difference. And so, I began preparing silently, watching, waiting, learning, as the construction moved steadily across what had been my family's life. And with each passing day, the anticipation built, the tension rising like the swell of water behind the dam. A quiet storm gathering in my chest, ready to break in a controlled, deliberate way that would leave no question about whose legacy still stood, whose history still mattered, and whose voice, long ignored, could finally be heard. I had been walking along the creek late one evening, the sky bruised with deep purples and the first stars beginning to shimmer, when I noticed something I had overlooked for years, a narrow stone channel leading from the old dam that curved beneath the hills toward the new homes, almost invisible under weeds and fallen leaves, and the realization hit me like a lightning strike. This was the key, the hidden path water could take if I acted, the way to make the land speak without destroying a single structure. And yet the thought sent a chill through me because it meant I was about to wield power I had never used, a force that could shift the entire situation in ways the HOA could never predict. Returned night after night, examining every stone, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on me, imagining the water flowing along the channel, and with every visit the tension wound tighter, because the plan was no longer theoretical, it was a heartbeat away from reality, and the closer I came to understanding how the dam could work in my favor, the more I felt the eyes of the neighborhood on me, even if they did not see, as though the land itself knew that its history was at stake, and was willing to whisper warnings through every ripple and rustle of leaves. One morning, I arrived to find surveyors from the HOA on my edge of the property, measuring, taking notes, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were beginning to notice what I had seen, that they too were starting to see the contours and channels I had memorized, and suddenly every step, every calculation, every secret I had kept felt fragile, like a rope fraying under weight, and I had to be more careful, more precise, more deliberate than ever, because any slip could undo everything I had prepared in my mind. The HOA representatives began asking questions, politely at first, about water flow and drainage, and each answer I gave had to be measured, neutral. Nothing that hinted at the dam's potential. Nothing that could tip them off to my growing plan. And yet each interaction felt like a dance on a knife's edge. Every word a test of their awareness. Every glance a measure of how much they suspected, while I silently plotted, imagining the water traveling its hidden path beneath streets and lawns, reclaiming its own way and reminding everyone who had forgotten that land could not be conquered without consequence. Tension became personal when a neighbor approached me. A cheerful woman with a stroller, her voice bright and intrusive, asking about property lines, gardening tips, and if I had any advice for raising the little creek that ran near their new home. And I realized with a jolt that they were encroaching unknowingly, treating the land as if it had no past, and the innocence in their questions collided with the anger simmering inside me, forcing me to hold my tongue, smile politely, and walk away, heart pounding because the stakes had grown, and what I was about to do would not only speak to the HOA but to every person who had ignored what belonged to someone else. That evening, I returned to the dam with a sense of urgency I had never felt, running my hands along the cold stones, listening to the water trickle in whispers, imagining the power it could release. And in that quiet moment I realized I was no longer simply defending my property. I was defending the soul of it, the memories embedded in every stone and tree, and the thought that someone could erase that without consequence made the blood in my veins pulse with a mixture of fear, determination, and a strange exhilaration, because finally I had a tangible way to act, a precise and deliberate measure of control in the face of overwhelming bureaucracy. The more I studied the channel, the more I noticed imperfections the builders had left, the slight slopes that could be manipulated, the minor blockages that, if cleared, would amplify the flow without causing destruction. And with every discovery my confidence grew. But so did the awareness that I was walking a line between genius and recklessness, between justice and chaos, because water, no matter how carefully guided, had a mind of its own, and one miscalculation could turn my carefully Planned act into disaster. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. The HOA had installed hidden pumps and drainage systems I had not known about, and as I inspected the channel under the fading light, I realized that if I ignored them, the water could be redirected or neutralized before it reached its intended path, and the realization made my pulse quicken, because it meant the plan had to evolve, the timing had to be flawless, the locks had to be opened in a sequence that accounted for their systems, or the land's voice would be silenced before it ever spoke. I spent nights poring over the old maps my grandfather had drawn, tracing every contour, measuring distances, recalculating volumes, imagining scenarios in which the water flowed perfectly, imagining countermeasures and solutions for every problem I could foresee, and each adjustment made the plan more intricate, more thrilling, and more dangerous, a puzzle that had to be solved perfectly to make a statement without crossing into harm. The stakes became personal in another way when I discovered a message taped inside the dam's maintenance hatch. Written decades ago by my grandfather, warning of the consequences of neglect, the power of water if misused, and the responsibility of those who understood the land, and the words hit me harder than anything the HOA could ever say, because they were a reminder that this was not about revenge, not about anger, but about stewardship, about honoring generations and proving that some forces, when respected and understood, could assert themselves more powerfully than bureaucracy, contracts, or money. As the days passed, I watched the houses rise higher, the streets become more defined, the neighborhood settle into a rhythm that was unaware of the storm gathering quietly beneath their feet, and with every truck, every laughter, every lawnmower that disturbed the old earth, my pulse quickened, my mind racing through contingencies, imagining the precise moment when the water would move, imagining the shock, the awe, the recognition that this land could not be claimed without acknowledgement, and realizing with a strange clarity that I had become the guardian, the interpreter, the voice of the land itself, and that whatever happened next would define not just the property, but the meaning of legacy, respect, and presence. The tension became unbearable, a constant hum under my skin, because I knew that I was walking the edge of something enormous, a moment that could shift the balance entirely, and I realized that when I finally acted, the neighborhood would never see me coming, the HOA would be powerless to stop it, and the land, finally heard and acknowledged, would reclaim its own story in a way that was precise, controlled, and unforgettable, and that knowledge both thrilled and terrified me, because the consequences were enormous, and yet I could feel, with certainty, that it was the only path left to defend what had always been mine. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, every step calculated, every glance toward the rising neighborhood sending a jolt of urgency through me. And then, one morning, as the sun burned through mist over the hills, I saw it. A surveyor leaning over the dam, examining stones I had memorized, tapping at channels that had been my secret for weeks, and a surge of panic hit me like a tidal wave because for the first time, I realized they might have noticed the hidden path, that someone could unravel everything I had planned before I even acted, and I had to decide instantly whether to move forward or retreat, knowing hesitation could cost me control over the land that had been in my family for generations. I spent that entire day circling the property, my mind racing with contingencies, calculating angles and water volumes, imagining ways to adjust the flow at the very last minute to compensate for any interference. And with each scenario, the stakes grew higher because I knew the HOA would not wait, that their next moves could seal the land's fate permanently, and every decision I made now had consequences that could echo across every street and lawn they had built. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I returned to the dam and ran my hands over the moss-covered stones, feeling the rough texture under my fingers like a pulse, a reminder that the land itself was alive, waiting, responding to my presence. And as I listened to the gentle trickle of water beneath the surface, a shock of recognition struck me, the realization that the dam itself had shifted slightly. During the construction, weakened in ways I had not accounted for, and for a moment, fear and exhilaration collided in my chest because what had been a precise plan was now a delicate gamble. A turning point where one wrong move could undo months of preparation or, if handled correctly, create a moment so perfect it would leave no doubt that the land could not be ignored. I spent hours inspecting the channel, tracing the path that water could take, testing small releases, feeling the pressure, listening to the response, and as darkness fell, I noticed a flash of movement in the distance, a shadow among the new houses, and I realized a neighbor had spotted me, a curious face peering from a second-story window, and my heart pounded because now the plan had an audience I hadn't anticipated, someone who might panic, call the HOA, or interfere, and I had to account for every possibility, every human variable that could turn the water from a message into chaos. The turning point became even sharper when I discovered a miscalculation in my own measurements, a slope that could either accelerate the flow too quickly or trap it entirely, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on me because this was no longer theoretical. The land was listening, the water waiting, and the consequences of failure were tangible, immediate, and personal, and I felt the full burden of what it meant to act as guardian, strategist, and interpreter of a force much older and stronger than any bureaucrat. By midnight, I had worked through every possible scenario, pacing along the dam, sketching on paper under the dim light of a lantern, imagining the water flowing across the lowlands, imagining the streets slowly becoming rivers without causing harm to people, imagining the awe and disbelief on the faces of neighbors who had forgotten the history beneath their feet, and in that moment, the stakes transformed from anger or revenge to a profound, almost sacred responsibility, the understanding that I was the only one who could act with precision, with respect, with knowledge, and that whatever happened would define not just the land but the measure of courage and respect I could command in the face of overwhelming odds. Then, as if the universe wanted to test me further, the HOA's landscape manager appeared unexpectedly near the edge of the dam, flashlight in hand, walking along the very stones I had been studying, and I froze, heart racing, imagining the entire plan unraveling in a moment of discovery. Yet I also felt a surge of clarity, a fierce focus sharpening in me, because I realized that this encounter was itself part of the turning point, the moment where hesitation could not exist, where action had to be precise, deliberate, and controlled, and I had to embrace both the risk and the responsibility of stepping forward despite uncertainty. I spent the next few hours maneuvering quietly, adjusting minor stones, clearing leaves, testing small channels, feeling the water's pulse like a heartbeat, knowing that if I timed it correctly, the flow would move exactly as I intended, unstoppable yet harmless, a message without malice, a demonstration of the land's power and my understanding of it. And as dawn approached, I stood at the edge of the dam, the sky fading from black to deep purple, feeling anticipation curl through me like electricity, knowing that the next hours would define everything, that the turning point had arrived, and that there was no turning back once I released the first measure of control, because the water, the land, and the neighborhood would finally meet in a confrontation that required courage, patience, and an unshakable resolve. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, my hands brushing the ancient stones, and in that moment, I understood that I was not just planning a course of action. I was enacting a reckoning, a revelation, a reminder that legacy and history cannot be ignored without consequence. And as the first light of morning touched the hills, I felt the tension peak, the suspense become almost unbearable, knowing that everything I had prepared, every calculation, every observation, every quiet night spent studying the land, was about to be tested in a moment that would change the course of my property, my family's history, and the lives of everyone who thought they could claim a place that was never theirs to take. The morning air was crisp, the mist still clinging to the edges of the hills, and my hands shook as I touched the dam one last time, feeling the weight of everything. Riding on this moment, the months of frustration, the anger at the HOA, the love for this land, and the responsibility my grandfather had entrusted to me all converging into a single heartbeat of anticipation. And then I released the first lock, feeling the water begin to move, a gentle push at first, a whisper of momentum, and I watched as it flowed into the narrow channel I had studied for weeks, gaining strength, sliding over stones, twisting and turning through the hills exactly as I had envisioned, carrying the quiet message of history, of presence, and of respect that no words or legal notice could ever convey. And in that instant, my chest swelled with a mix of fear, triumph, and awe, because the land itself seemed alive, responding to my touch, moving with a power that was patient yet unstoppable. The water began to spread across the lowlands, first in shallow, shimmering streams that reflected the pale morning sun, then gathering force, winding around streets, creeping along lawns, bending around sidewalks, yet never breaking, never destroying, moving like a living sculpture guided by my careful planning. And as the first neighbor stepped outside, coffee in hand, eyes widening in disbelief, I felt the tension explode into reality, because every gaze, every gesture, every stunned whisper confirmed that the message had been delivered, that the land had reclaimed its voice in a way that left no doubt about who had been overlooked and who understood it best. I could hear the HOA sirens in the distance, the frantic voices of engineers and managers trying to assess the flow, to redirect the water, to restore control. But I remained on the dam, calm yet trembling, watching as their precision met the patience and knowledge of someone who had known this land for a lifetime. And I realized in that moment that power did not always come from money, permits, or authority, but from understanding, preparation, and courage. And the irony that the very bureaucracy that had dismissed me was now helpless against a force they had ignored made my heart race with a bittersweet satisfaction. The water moved steadily, filling the shallow depressions of the old hills, washing over the areas where my grandparents had once tended gardens and played, reflecting the sky in dazzling patterns. And I felt a profound connection to every generation that had walked these hills before me, as if their presence was flowing alongside mine, a quiet affirmation that I was not alone in this moment, that the land and my family were aligned in purpose, and that the history the HOA had tried to erase could not be silenced. Neighbors emerged, some standing frozen on porches, some calling out to one another in confusion, and I watched their faces, some shocked, some fearful, some fascinated, and I felt a strange surge of empathy, knowing they had not intended harm, yet their ignorance had contributed to the disrespect of a legacy, and this moment, while controlled, was teaching them, reminding them that some things in life require respect, patience, and recognition beyond mere ownership. The HOA scrambled frantically, running from street to street, engineers shouting instructions, vehicles moving to block the flow, cameras rolling to capture the chaos, and I remained still, observing the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity, because I had not sought revenge, only acknowledgement, and yet the drama unfolding before me was undeniable, the power of nature and preparation displayed in a way no courtroom or boardroom ever could have conveyed. As the water crept toward the edge of the neighborhood, gently inundating areas they had thought permanent, I realized the full scope of my action, that this was not destruction but a demonstration, a reclaiming of dignity, a restoration of voice, and I felt tears prick my eyes, a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet sorrow for the months of struggle that had brought me here, for the anger and helplessness I had carried, for the moments of doubt and fear, all culminating in this singular, unforgettable act of reclamation. Engineers and HOA officials finally approached the dam cautiously, their expressions unreadable, a combination of respect and frustration, and I knew I had their attention, that the months of being dismissed and ignored were finally met with a tangible, undeniable consequence. And yet no one had been harmed, no home destroyed, only a reminder that power comes in many forms and history cannot be silenced. By late morning, the water began to settle, finding its natural low points, leaving behind wet soil, shimmering puddles, and a visual testament to the path it had taken. And I walked along the channel, feeling the damp earth beneath my boots, the cool breeze on my face, and a profound sense of completion, because this was more than a message, more than a moment of action. It was proof that preparation, courage, and respect for the land could achieve what frustration and anger alone never could. And in that clarity, I felt a deep peace, knowing I had honored my grandparents, my family, and the history embedded in every stone and tree. The neighborhood slowly began to adjust, residents speaking in hushed tones, surveying the altered landscape, HOA representatives taking notes, engineers assessing the minor disruptions, and I realized that this was the fallout, the immediate consequence of my action. A moment of reckoning that left no doubt in anyone's mind that the land had a voice and that its history could not be ignored, and I felt the rush of emotion swell inside me. A combination of triumph, relief, and the quiet joy of knowing that the months of tension, planning, and fear had culminated in a controlled, dramatic assertion of what had always been mine, and that for the first time since this nightmare began, I could breathe without the weight of frustration pressing down, because the land had been heard, the message delivered, and the turning point achieved in a way that would linger in memory long after the waters receded. The days after the water settled felt surreal, like the world itself had paused to catch its breath, and I walked the land slowly, boots sinking into damp soil, tracing the channels where the water had flowed, listening to the soft gurgle of remaining streams, and feeling an odd mixture of relief, pride, and exhaustion settle deep into my bones, because the immediate chaos of the neighborhood had passed. The HOA had retreated to meetings and calls, and yet the impact of what had happened lingered like a memory etched in every puddle, every flattened lawn, every patch of soil turned dark and rich by the water, a quiet testament that the land had been acknowledged, that its history could not be erased, and that my voice, finally, had been heard. Residents began speaking to me differently, some hesitant at first, some still incredulous, but there was a shift in tone, a subtle acknowledgement that I had acted with knowledge and care, that my connection to the property ran deeper than they had imagined, and even the HOA, after an initial flurry of frustration, approached with caution and a new willingness to discuss boundaries and preservation, and I realized that what I had feared as permanent conflict had instead opened the door to dialogue, respect, and a reconsideration of how the land could be used responsibly, leaving me with a sense of vindication I had never thought I would feel. As I walked past the houses now settled into the landscape, I noticed the small adjustments residents had begun to make, preserving old trees, leaving wild patches of grass, tending gardens with a newfound respect for the natural flow of water and the curves of the land, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my actions had taught more than just caution, that they had imparted a lesson about legacy, patience, and stewardship that no sign or rule could convey, a reminder that the human presence on land must coexist with the past and the forces that shaped it, and that care and understanding could prevent mistakes the HOA's bureaucracy never could. I returned to the dam often, not to act, but to observe, to sit on its moss-covered stones and feel the water move with gentle inevitability. And in those moments, the burden I had carried for weeks began to lift, replaced by clarity, by a sense that the land and I were aligned, that the struggle had been necessary, and that the resolution, though quiet and understated, was as powerful as any confrontation could have been, because it had been rooted in respect and intelligence rather than anger or vengeance. Friends and family visited after hearing the story, their eyes wide with amazement at the control I had exercised and the way the land had responded. And while I could see admiration and relief in their faces, what mattered most to me was the recognition of the land itself, the knowledge that it had survived, adapted, and reminded others that it held more than soil and stone. It held memory, history, and an inherent power that could not be denied, and that the role I had played as its guardian had given me an understanding of responsibility, courage, and patience that would stay with me long after the water had dried from the lowlands. I began documenting every detail, sketching the channels, noting the flow patterns, recording observations about soil, drainage, and the interaction with the new construction, not as a threat but as a guide for future residents and the HOA itself, a way to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. And in doing so, I realized that my relationship with the neighborhood had shifted entirely, from opposition and resentment to cautious collaboration, a sense that boundaries, respect, and knowledge could coexist even when initial conflicts seemed insurmountable, and that the lesson of the dam was now part of the shared memory of the place. Walking past the homes, I noticed neighbors now nodding as we passed, offering smiles that had been absent before, conversations beginning about gardening, preservation, and the history of the land, and I felt the tension of months slowly dissolve, replaced by a quiet pride in having restored not only my own sense of control, but the understanding that coexistence was possible when one remembered to honor the past and the forces at play beneath the surface. I spent long afternoons sitting on the hillside, watching sunlight shift across the landscape, noticing small changes, the way water collected in natural basins, how wildlife returned to areas they had avoided, how the land seemed to breathe more freely, and I understood that this resolution was not about winning or losing but about balance, about restoring respect, and about recognizing that the quiet power of knowledge, preparation, and patience could create outcomes more lasting than any confrontation born of anger. By the time the week ended, the neighborhood had accepted small adjustments. HOA officials had agreed to consultations on land management, and I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that the legacy my grandparents had left was protected, honored, and recognized, not through force, but through careful, deliberate action that had let the land speak in its own language, a language of water, soil, and memory that no construction or bureaucracy could erase. As I stood on the dam one last time, feeling the wind across my face, watching the sunlight glitter on the remaining pools of water, I realized that the journey had changed me as much as it had changed the land, teaching me that patience, courage, and respect for forces beyond control could achieve more than confrontation alone, and that the quiet assertion of presence, history, and understanding could create outcomes that were fair, lasting, and meaningful, leaving the land, the neighborhood, and myself transformed in ways that would echo for generations to come. A reminder that some victories are not loud or destructive, but are felt in the heart, the soil, and the gentle movement of water across a land that will always remember who cared enough to defend it. Months had passed since the water had flowed and the land had spoken, and I found myself walking the hills with a quiet sense of peace I hadn't known in years, the memory of that morning still vivid, but softened by time, and in that silence I realized how much the experience had changed me, not just in how I saw the property or the neighborhood, but in how I approached life, understanding now that patience, careful observation, and knowledge could achieve more than anger or confrontation, and that sometimes the most powerful actions were those that respected the forces at play rather than trying to dominate them. I watched the seasons shift, the creek meandering through the hills, wildlife returning to areas once ignored, and neighbors slowly adapting to the land in ways that showed awareness and respect, planting trees thoughtfully, leaving patches of wild grass, and even smiling at me with the understanding that our shared space had a history and a life beyond what anyone could build or claim, and I felt a quiet pride knowing that the lessons of the dam had endured beyond the immediate chaos, creating a legacy not just for my family but for the entire community. In myself, I noticed a change, a confidence tempered with humility, a recognition that control was never absolute, that even the best-laid plans required flexibility and respect for forces larger than any one person, and that true victory was measured not in destruction or punishment but in balance, understanding, and the quiet knowledge that right action leaves a mark far more lasting than fear or resentment ever could. Conversations with the HOA had transformed as well, evolving from tense, dismissive meetings to cautious collaboration, their representatives now willing to consult on water management and environmental preservation. And while they would never fully admit the impact of what I had done, their actions spoke louder than any words could, a subtle acknowledgement that the land's history and integrity mattered, and that my voice, once ignored, could influence decisions in a way that bureaucracy alone never allowed. I reflected on the moments of fear and uncertainty, the nights spent pacing the dam, the careful calculations, the anticipation, and I realized that every emotion had been necessary, each fear a reminder of responsibility, each adrenaline surge a testament to the stakes involved, and the clarity that followed was more than relief. It was a profound understanding of what it meant to act with intention, courage, and respect, lessons that extended beyond land into every aspect of life where patience, knowledge, and moral clarity mattered. The neighborhood had changed too, slowly, subtly, as people began to recognize the curves of the land, the channels of water, the patterns that had existed long before streets and lawns were laid, and I watched children play in areas where the earth had been left to flow naturally, listening to laughter and the occasional splash from the creek, and I felt a warmth that came from knowing the land and its history had endured, and that the community, even unintentionally, had learned something valuable about the consequences of ignoring what they could not fully understand. I thought often of my grandparents, their stories, their guidance, the care they had poured into this place, and I felt their presence in every stone, every tree, every ripple of water. A reminder that the past never truly leaves us, that the legacies we inherit are alive in ways that demand respect and thoughtful stewardship, and that protecting them is both a responsibility and a privilege that shapes who we are and how we act in the world. I walked the hills alone sometimes, the wind in my hair and the sun casting long shadows across the fields. I reflected on how anger and frustration had guided me at first, but it was understanding, preparation, and careful action that created lasting results, and that the lesson of the dam extended far beyond property or legal disputes, touching on the value of foresight, the power of quiet determination, and the importance of aligning action with principles rather than impulse. I began sharing the story in small ways with neighbors and friends, not as a tale of revenge or spectacle, but as a story of responsibility, patience, and respect for what cannot be ignored, and I noticed how people responded differently, some with curiosity, some with reflection, others with gratitude for the reminder that even in the face of bureaucracy and power, knowledge and care can create outcomes that are both fair and enduring. And in those conversations, I realized that the impact of what I had done was multiplying, creating lessons that would persist in ways beyond my immediate control. The land itself became a teacher, showing me that the flow of water, the rise and fall of the seasons, the resilience of trees and soil, all mirrored life in ways that demanded attention and humility, that patience and respect for natural patterns produced outcomes impossible through force alone, and that sometimes the most powerful acts are those that restore balance rather than claim dominance, a realization that shaped not only my actions on the property but my perspective on relationships, work, and every decision that involved forces beyond my own. Looking back, I understood that the moment of release at the dam had been as much about reclaiming history as it had been about proving to myself that I could act decisively in alignment with principle, that courage guided by knowledge could create change without destruction, and that the emotional storm I had carried through those months had forged a deeper, calmer understanding of who I was and what I valued most, a clarity that would remain long after the water had receded and the neighborhood settled into its rhythm. And so, as the sun rose over the hills each morning, painting the land in gold and shadow, I walked among the trees and streams with gratitude, pride, and quiet awe, knowing that the land, the legacy, and the lessons I had learned would endure, that respect and patience had proven stronger than dismissal and bureaucracy, and that the voice of history, when honored with courage and intelligence, could never be silenced, leaving me with a sense of completion and reflection that was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that the forces we inherit and protect define us in ways we may never fully comprehend, but whose impact resonates far beyond our own lifetimes, a truth that would guide me, and perhaps others, for all the years to come.